Greetings, YouTube. There was a horrendous case a few years ago in India where a woman was gang raped on board public transportation and then thrown off, left for dead, her companion beaten as well. She later died of her injuries. The rapists have been convicted and sentenced to death. While I applaud their conviction, I do oppose the death penalty, as I am opposed to execution in all cases. But there's another side to this. It's also a tragedy, though I'm not going to demean anyone by making a comparison of which tragedy is greater. In it, the wives of one of those accused rapists, convicted rapists, is in a very, very poor position. You see, in the very conservative rural environment she lives in, as soon as her husband's dead, she loses everything. You see, in her particular section of the world, a woman can't hold a job, and without a breadwinner in the form of a husband or a family, her family, if she hasn't been married yet, she has nowhere to go. And that's not her hyperbole. Her family cannot take her back, as they cannot afford to support her and her child. There just isn't enough food for them. And her current in-laws will just throw her out, because they can also not afford to support her. There isn't enough food for them. Her husband was the breadwinner, and at the moment, at the time of this article at least, he was still alive. And in this kind of a limbo state, his relatives were essentially feeding her scraps and her child scraps to keep them going. But once he is definitively dead, and she is no longer their daughter by marriage, she's out. She has nowhere to go. There's nothing for her, no options for her. There aren't going to be any Indiegogo campaigns where she's going to get donations so she can live. In the world she is from, in the tradition she is from, she is out of options. And I frequently discuss male privilege in the Western world. And people are always like, oh, well, it doesn't exist, and things like that. And I'm not going to argue Western male privilege in a moment. But here you go, folks. Here's an example of real-world male privilege. It's not in the first world, I freely admit this. But it is a little more stark than we are used to seeing. There are no shades of, well, are women really making less than men kind of a thing. In this case, it is definitively, if you don't have a male to protect you in the form of either a father or a husband, you can be thrown out to die, along with your child. So this is the downside of tradition, though I have to be honest, there are times I'm really not sure if there's an upside to tradition. I'm opposed to tradition for the most part. The hardest laws in the world and rules to change are the unwritten rules. The ones that society and the cultures around us impose and aren't written down, but are still supported and endorsed by those who can make our lives miserable. The bullies of the world, if you will. And here you go, folks. Here's a person, a real live person and her child. They have no options, because tradition says they have no options.